for putting the binding on the piped quilt sandwich, it's a little bit awkward at first because we're doing everything upside down and backwards. This is my 2.5 inch cut binding that has been folded in half and pressed. The cut edge goes along the right edge of the quilt. I'm lining up all my cut edges over here, but look, I'm throwing the bulk of the binding out away from me, and I know that's not what we typically do. So this is going to feel pretty awkward the first time you do it, but hang in there, good luck. Now to sew this, you see that I've pinned it. To sew it, we're going to flip it upside down like this. And we're going to begin sewing down here so that all that tail is left unsewn. Makes it much easier to join the tails at the end. So let me show you how to sew this at the machine. My quilt is upside down, my binding is pinned along the edge, and where I want to stitch is just to the left, which is closer to the cording, of the piping stitching line. These stitching lines you see here are my piping stitching lines, where I sewed my piping on. So I still like the open toe foot so I can see real easily. Now I want to stop exactly at that intersection. I'll get rid of that pin. I'm going to back it up a little bit here. Now you can back stitch at this point if you like, but I like turning the quilt and going off the edge. And now I've gone down to teeny tiny little stitches just to hold it real tight. You know, that's an optional thing. Now, for taking care of the miter, it's quite similar to what we've done in the past, but it's backwards. So we go to the right side of the quilt and flip this binding away from the next edge. Here's the next edge. I'm flipping it away from the next edge. This needs to be a straight line. This little fold here needs to cross exactly where those pipings touch. When it does that, then you're going to get a good corner of your quilt there. Now I'm going to try to pin left-handed, which is always a little bit of a joke. All right, I almost got it without hurting myself. There we go. All right, so I pin that diagonal. Then I flip this pot binding up onto the next edge of the quilt. Now here's another checkpoint. We want to make sure that fold right here is exactly at the edge of the quilt sandwich, not hanging over and not too short. It's right at the edge of the quilt sandwich. Then I will take and pin this whole edge in place. Then time to sew the next edge. So I flip it over, back to the wrong side again, and start sewing out here just to the left of that piping stitching line. I'll go on down this side, stop at that intersection again. Now I've got the binding around the quilt. I did the fourth side, but then only stitched a little bit after that fourth side. We want a big gap in the side of the quilt. Now on a quilt this tiny, that's almost the whole side of the quilt, but I like to have a gap about 2 hand widths. Now to join these tails, oh, I think that's the most awful thing quilters have to do, is join the tails of the binding. Nobody likes it. But take one tail and lay it down. Take the next tail and lay it down. And then what we're going to do is cut so that they overlap a certain distance. That certain distance that they overlap is the binding cut width. In this case, it's 2.5 plus 1/4 inch. So the overlap will be 2 3/4. Now I've got this diagonal here, and I'm going to get rid of that. I'm going to cut that off so I have a straight end there. All right, like that. And now I'm going to measure from there. I'm going to measure 2 3/4, and you try to be accurate with that. I'll make a little pin, or you make a little mark or whatever where you need to cut that down there. Don't make it too long, whatever you do. If you're going to error on the short side. Okay, there I've got my overlap is 2 3/4 inches. That's the binding cut width plus 1/4 inch. Now we do the kiss, twist, wiggle. So stick your fingers in the top, and they, like 2 dolphins jumping out of the water, they kiss right sides together. Then we twist. It doesn't matter which one you twist in which direction, just so you see now they're making the corner of a square. Now this is the awkward part. We bunch up the quilt, get this down on the table or whatever, and it's time to wiggle. You wiggle so that each tail sticks out beyond the other 1/8 of an inch. And then pin that in place. If this is too awkward, it means you sewed too much binding to the quilt. You have to take some stitching out. So you see I have 1/8 of an inch hanging out here, a generous 1/8. Don't be skimpy with that. And 1/8 of an inch hanging out here. And then I will sew from this crevice to this crevice. And then the binding, when you do like this, the binding will fit the quilt. Pin it on, flip it over, finish sewing it. When that is done, then it's time finishing the back is the only thing that's left. Now I like to start by first pressing my binding out away from the piping to expose that piping. It is such a thrill. If you happen to see any stitching, just don't press that piping out so hard. Just press it so that it covers any stitching, but I admire it. Every time too. And then in the corners, just really put your iron into that corner. Then it's time, I'm going to just go ahead and do that. Then it's time to finish the back. Now I like to finish the back by hand so that I have a show quality back, but here we go. Now somewhere along the line we were taught to wrap your binding just to that piping or that regular stitching line, but I wrap it as far as it needs to go so that it's plump, clear to that outer edge. So my binding is a little bit wider on the back. So then you just hand stitch that down, that's all there is to it. Now here on the corners we need to pay attention. Where's the bulk on the front? Well, the bulk on the front is over here, which means we want the bulk on the back to be on this side. So you would stitch it so that that corner went like this. Then tuck that down a little further so that that diagonal line meets where they intersect right there, and there you go. Now if you wanted to, you could put some fusible here and iron that down, and then go to the front and machine stitch right there between the piping and the binding, and it would catch the binding on the back, and then you have a machine finish. So I hope you'll give this a try. It's a lot of fun. It's an impressive finish for the quilts, and you can visit my website, piecesbewithyou.com. Good luck!